So I would just like to move to the next speaker, please. So Barbara Engels is the Deputy Head of the International Nature Conservation in the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, and she's a member of the German delegation to the World Heritage Committee. And Barbara's talk today is entitled Natural Heritage and Sustainable Development, a Realistic Option or Wishful Thinking. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, Claire. I must admit I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation, which has two reasons. One is that I think sometimes it's useful not to have a presentation because then you are able to either act on what some of your pre-speakers have said, although you have no slide on this, and the other one is I was just too busy when preparing for the committee meeting, and I must apologize that I might have to leave before the end of the session, so if there's an really urgent question, you might put it just at the end of my talk. You have seen a lot of pictures from cultural heritage sites in Giovanni Boccardi's presentation. If I had a presentation, you would see a lot of green, or maybe blue, either forest sites or big national parks or oceans, and giving an idea of what I'm talking about is, of course, it's natural heritage. It's the other half. No, it's not the other half. It's maybe the other quarter in the World Heritage Convention. At least it what concerns sites.
It's a third.
Is it? A fifth?
Third.
A third? 300? No.
A third of the World Heritage
Is yeah, almost. Wish we had a third. So on natural heritage sites and how this relates to sustainable development. And when we look at the history of the convention and all its related documents, there was no sustainable development and no sustainable use in the convention at its beginning. Not at all. The only thing it talked about was conservation or preservation or protection, using different terms. And it was quite late how it came in, and I'll try to do a little bit of history in the beginning, where sustainability actually comes from. It's nothing new. Although it appeared on the international agenda in the beginning of the 1990s, the concept is an old one. It's from 1713, when a forester, in a very important forestry book, which was an economics book, wrote about the notion of sustainability, and when he asked about how silviculture, so forestry, could be done best to achieve a continuous sustainable use, because it was indispensable, and otherwise people would have nothing to eat. So it's a really old concept, and it comes from the context of the use of natural resources. I think that's quite important to remind us, because the connection between sustainable development and natural resources sometimes seems to be a bit closer than in the cultural context. Since the 1980s, this notion of sustainability has been used a bit more, and it was actually in a United Nations Commission report, which was called Our Common Future in 1987, when really sustainability came first, or sustainable development came first to the international scene, so to say. And from this point, it made its way silently, more or less silently, in different international conventions, including the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. But I would like to mention another important international convention which deals with natural heritage in a broader sense first, and this is the so-called Convention on Biodiversity. And this convention is a bit different from the World Heritage Convention, because it puts sustainable development, sustainable use of natural resources as a second pillar next to the protection. So this talks about protection of natural resources, about the sustainable use, and then, very important, the appropriate and adequate sharing of benefits and the access to benefit sharing of when people use these resources. For example, the people living in these areas. So really important, the CBD is there. It's there since 1992. And this is earlier than the notion of sustainable development came into the World Heritage Convention. And this convention has developed over the last years quite a lot of approaches and precise guidelines on sustainable use of natural resources in various contexts, on tourism, on even on linkages to culture. So there is a wealth of experience in another international context, at least concerning natural heritage, already available. And more important, maybe even more importantly, when it comes really to a connection to the site level, there is a second UNESCO. It's not a UNESCO convention, it's a UNESCO program. It's the so-called Man and Biosphere program, which was established in 1976, and since the 1990s, focuses on man and biosphere reserves as model regions, model areas for sustainable development. So where the protection of natural resources and the sustainable use of these is integrated. I think that's quite important to know that we have not only the World Heritage Convention out there, but some complementary tool to use them, maybe as a complement, maybe even in the same local setting, in the same geographic setting. And I might give a quick example later in my talk. As I said before, in the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, sustainable use was not in there in the beginning. It made its way slowly into the convention, and it was first used in 1994 with the notion of sustainable land use in the operational guidelines. Since 2002, the operational guidelines include the notion of sustainable use, sustainable development in several paragraphs, and one very importantly notes that the protection and conservation of the natural and cultural heritage are a significant contribution to sustainable development. So I think it's important to read that with a very detailed view. It's a contribution to sustainable development. It doesn't mean that sustainable development is the solution for everything, but that these can contribute. I think it's important to bear that in mind. And when we look into the database, which is thanks to the World Heritage Center been made available, where you can research in the various committee decisions, you can find since 1999 a more regular reference in committees' decisions to sustainable development. But there are a few. I was just curious and did a search on that database, and I found between 3 and 11 findings per yearly committee session. That's not a lot. Just maybe it's framed in another way in the decisions, but the notion of sustainable development or sustainable use is still not made its way, at least not in the official committee decisions text. And when we look more closely into sustainable use in this question of whether it is sustainable use or is it conservation, and we heard a few committee discussions in the last days even here, where was mentioning of, okay, we need to protect that important site, but we need to allow development. But the question is it about allowing development, and what sort of a development are we allowing? And how does that fit with sustainable development? I think these are still two questions which are a little bit distinct. In 2006, the UNESCO World Heritage Center published a strategy on natural heritage, which was then endorsed by the World Heritage Committee. And this strategy directly defers to the notion of sustainable development in its mission statement. I think that's also quite important to keep in mind. And what is also really worth mentioning in this context is that if we look at the World Heritage, the natural sites on the World Heritage lists, of course they are protected because of their values of their OUV, but in addition to this, they bring more to the world than just this OUV, which is worth protecting. And IUCN has published last winter a very comprehensive study on benefits of natural World Heritage sites, looking a bit more closely what exactly are these benefits, to be able to really dig out, what is the benefit? Is the benefit a better protection, or do these benefits go beyond? And these benefits are really large. They range from water supply, from clean air. They range from delivery of food supply for the local communities. So here we get in a very close connection between direct use of either the site themselves or the ecosystem services this site produces. And we need to be aware of that we have a sort of uses which deliver direct benefits, either to the people living in the near vicinity of the site, in the site, or even further away. And there are a few nice examples in this study which show that, for example, water purification may deliver a benefit not only in the vicinity of the site, but far beyond to the next bigger city, which might live from the provision of clean water from this city. Or people living depending on the fish resources in a lake, which is further away from a river, which is somewhere which is located somewhere else. So we need to see these connections very carefully here in the context of natural heritage. And in the operational guidelines, it is noted concerning natural heritage, and especially when it comes to integrity question, that no area is totally pristine, and that all natural areas are in dynamic state and to some extent involve contact with people. Yes, of course, we have natural heritage sites on the lists which are very, very far away, which are very difficult to access. And in these cases, the question of sustainable development or sustainable use might not be a real question. That might be the very high mountains or very remote islands where just humankind doesn't get that easily. But for all other sites, the question of sustainable use, either in or around the site, matters a lot. And when we look at the threats, and I'm taking you Giovanni's list of military vocabulary, I agree, threat is a bad word. But there is a range of threats which have all to do with the use. It's about encroachment, it's about poaching, it's about illegal logging, or over-exploitation of marine resources, sometimes even exactly these resources what the site is inscribed for. We talked about East Rennell on the Solomon Islands 2 days ago, or mining, where what the resource use is, the oil, has nothing to do with the OUV of the site. Whilst in Solomon Islands, the marine resources are the attribute of the OUV of the site. So I think we also have to be very careful to distinguish what are we meaning. Are we using natural resources which are part of OUV, or are we using some resource which is somewhere near or in the property, but which might have nothing to do with the OUV of the site itself? It's an idea which strikes me sometimes when we talk about that we have to allow things in a site for the better of the site. And then I'm thinking about, okay, why is oil drilling in a site important for the protection of that site? For me, that doesn't fit. But the question gets a different angle when it says, okay, there are people which have been living in these areas for decades, for centuries, and they are linked to the preservation of this site, maybe in a cultural landscape where their use of the natural resources contributes even to OUV. Well, it's a completely different issue. As I said, I think it's not the question of allowing development or not allowing development, but ensuring that development doesn't impact on the OUV means having development which allows OUV on a long-term perspective to sustain. I think that's just the question what sustainable development on a natural site or even on a cultural site means. It's not on a short-term perspective. And coming back on the man and biosphere reserves, I think we can learn a lot from this program and model of which is existing in the UNESCO context. Because in a biosphere reserve, you usually have what you call a core zone, which is more or less strictly protected, so which allows for the protection of the core values. And then comes a buffer zone. This is what we know from World Heritage. A core which is inscribed and some buffer zone which allows buffering to impacts from the external. But the biosphere reserves add a third layer, which is the so-called transition zone, which is there to allow, to steer, and to promote sustainable development. And actually, there are a few sites already inscribed in the list which follow this model. The World Heritage Site is sitting inside a much larger biosphere reserves. And in my view, these sites have a much greater potential to deal with these questions of sustainable use because they have some either legal or institutional and management setting which allows for this sustainable development. And this would be my call, thinking about models and management models to include management of the resources in a sustainable way in direct connection to what is the core and the World Heritage values. Thank you.